Of the Politics Spring Lecture Series, which is on Demagogues, Populism and the Age of Trump. And sincere apologies if anyone has come as a consequence of the ODT ad, which was advertising a completely different seminar on the post-Cold War, but that one's in October, so come back in October for that one. So if you need to leave, do so, but if you stay, we'd be very pleased to have you. So populism, as the picture for our poster suggests, is generally seen in everyday speech and also in political thought to be dangerous, and particularly dangerous for democracy. It evokes very negative... Yes? Oh, sorry. I'm Vicky Spencer from the Politics program. And I'll be introducing my colleagues very shortly. So, populism is generally seen to be in very negative terms. It tends to evoke right-wing authoritarian leaders who have a tendency to appeal to the more debased elements of the masses and to manipulate them in order to have certain scapegoats and to go against certain outsiders like refugees or immigrants. So from the perspective of progressive democratic politics, on the whole, most of the rhetoric is very anti-populism. But that seems to also be somewhat of a paradox because we live in democratic societies. And in order to be able to win an election, you have to be popular. And popular leaders are often seen to be an asset to their parties. So on the one hand, it evokes images of Hitler in Germany, Pauline Hanson in Australia, where I'm from, and Donald Trump is our most recent leader to hate in the United States. And the ghost has come back. Obviously doesn't want us to talk about this particular issue. But on the other hand, there are certain democratic leaders who have been really popular, and the democratic left and liberals really love. Like, for example, Barack Obama in the United States, and going back a few years, because there's probably been not one for a while, but Bob Hawke in Australia, who seemed to, in 1 year, win pretty much every sporting event in the world that was important for Australians. So he was definitely loved at the time. So this evening, our panel is going to challenge the conventional political wisdom that it's something negative and explore under what conditions can a populist, charismatic leader actually be good for democracy. And I'm very pleased tonight to be able to introduce and welcome a very good colleague and friend from Victoria University, Wellington, who is a senior lecturer in political theory and also the head of the School of History, Philosophy, Political Science and International Relations, which is rather a mouthful. He is the author of 2 books, Non-Democratic Politics and Authoritarianism, Dictatorship and Democratization. And his other book is A Stranger's Knowledge, Statesman, Philosophy and Law in Plato's Statesman. He's also the editor of a collection entitled Democratic Moments, and his interests include non-democratic politics, so you're welcome to ask him questions about that as well as Greek, ancient Greek and Roman thought. He's written book chapters and articles and other thinkers like Foucault, Anna Arendt, John Rawls, and he's also an expert on the history of democratic thought. And his paper today is entitled Demagogues, Charisma and Representation in the Age of Trump. So Harvey is going to give his talk for about half an hour. And then my other very good colleague, who we're lucky enough to have in the politics program at Otago, and she's also in philosophy, Professor Lisa Ellis, is going to talk for 15, maybe 20 minutes in response to Javier's paper. And it's actually because Javier gave both of us an early draft of this paper that we read earlier this year that we decided to invite him because we thought it was such an interesting paper and so relevant for current politics. Now, Lisa, if you don't know her, is the author of 2 books on Kant's political thought and also an editor of a collection on Kant's political theory. She's also the co-editor of the Wiley Blackwell 8-volume Encyclopedia of Political Thought. However, since she's given up Kant, she's become an environmental political theorist. And she's also from the United States, so the particular events at the moment, certainly she will have some useful reflections on them. So after that, then we're going to do the roving TV presenter with the microphone so that you can ask questions, and I'll be running around on that. So I'll turn the microphone over to Javier.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me here. As Vicky said, I'm going to talk to you about demagogues, charisma, and representation in the age of Trump. Let's see if this clicker works. No, it doesn't. So, we'll start by thinking about demagogues. The idea of a demagogue has long been seen as a pathology of democracy. So ever since the first discussions in ancient Greece about democracy, the demagogue has been seen as a kind of the ever-present danger that democratic politics faces. We think of the demagogue as, the kind of person who appeals to prejudice, passion, bigotry, and so on, to mislead the public, to make them, mislead them about their real, genuine interests, to incite the baser passions of the public, to make the weaker argument appear the stronger, as the ancient Greek phrase had it. Now, the word didn't always have this meaning. In the earliest usage, the demagogue simply means the leader of the demos, the leader of the people. But very early on, it appeared as the bad leader of the people, the person who threatens to turn democracy into the rule of the mob, or threatens to move democracy towards tyranny. Now, even today, we find that the demagogue sort of remains a stubborn, persistent problem in democracy. One only has to mention Trump. It's a kind of classic demagogic politics. And in order to think about this, I want to turn to the thought of Max Weber. Max Weber is, of course, towering figure, 20th century social sciences. And he was writing around the time of the First World War. And he had an interestingly ambivalent view of the demagogue. He thought that, demagogues were actually kind of not only inevitable, but sometimes quite necessary in democratic politics. Not only that, they could be a positive force in democracy. So I want to talk about kind of 3 questions. So the first one is, why is it that demagogy, kind of in a broad sense of the word, is kind of inevitable in modern democratic politics? And why might it be necessary? Then I'll talk about a little bit about how, where do demagogues get their authority? Why can they be effective? Why is it that demagogic appeals seem to be quite effective sometimes? And the final bit is about under what conditions you can turn sort of demagogic leaders into responsible politicians. How is demagoguery potentially a positive thing? Now, there's a kind of an ambivalent view. Weber didn't claim that demagogues were good in general, but he didn't claim that they were bad in general either. So let's start by the first question. When we think about modern democracy, there are kind of two facts that Weber thought were very important to keep in mind. The first of all is that politics is always what we might call agonistic. It's about struggle. There are contending visions of the common interest. People disagree about fundamental values, and they fight about them. They're not simply satisfied with letting the other side win. So politics expresses a struggle between contending parties, literally political parties, which express different views of what the common interest or the national interest actually are. And the second thing to note here is that politics in modern democratic societies is mass politics. Our societies are large and complex. They're not small-scale places. Even New Zealand is, by the standards of, say, ancient democracies, a pretty large place. And so the contest between these different visions of values, of interest, and so on is always about loyalty of very large numbers of people. You have to persuade the voters. And persuading the voters is a kind of mass industrial sort of enterprise. So there is a development of persuasive techniques, people trying to persuade people, the voters, to support one side or another of this struggle over visions of the common interest. And so Weber thought that when you think about these two conditions, you basically are going to get two different kinds of leaders emerge in democracy. These are kind of rough tendencies. It's not the only thing that happens. But the first one we can call sort of the vote-getting specialist, the professional politician, the person who knows their way about campaign contributions, PR, how to get the retail vote out, and so on and so forth. Somebody who understands how to create or produce large numbers of voters for a particular vision of the common interest. And then there is another side to this, which is what you might call the specialist in persuasion. So there's the party man, or the party person, and the demagogue, the person who is able to, who has a knack or a gift for crafting kind of persuasive narratives of identity or of interest and so on, and therefore can put people on their side. Right? In fact, he even said that, this is one reason that why lawyers have a comparative advantage in democratic politics, because they're trained to argue their case, they're trained to make speeches, and so they end up being the kind of people who can thrive in the environment of democratic politics. So when he was writing, he had in mind something like the Gilded Age of American politics. You have the so-called machine politics of the time, a professional party man, professional machine politician of the time is the sort of guy who wasn't necessarily very good at giving a speech, but he was good at transactional leadership of the kind that getting benefits doled out so that the voters will turn out and put the party in power. Favors are given, There's this whole form of retail politics that led to a kind of politician who had power, but wasn't necessarily representing any larger cause, right? So these are people who only cared about power and the rewards it brings. The sort of unprincipled politics where, we can find many examples of this today, where we see political leaders who don't seem to have a very clear set of principles. They go where the wind blows. They go with whatever votes, wherever you get the most votes, wherever you can get the most campaign money, wherever you can get the most favors, and so on and so forth. I think perhaps one example of this that's particularly clear is Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate right now in the U.S. I think of this as a political figure who is clearly a sort of machine politician. He's not a charismatic political leader. He's not the sort of person who has a clear ideological or grand vision of politics. He seems to be in it for the power, right? I've ever thought, all in all, this is not a good thing. If all you have are politicians who are machine politicians, who represent kind of narrow interests, you get a plutocratic politics of business interests, of very narrow interest groups contending together without any larger set of values. So what's the alternative here? And he thought, well, the alternative to this sort of narrow interest-based politics is the politics of charismatic leadership. Just one example here. And this is a politics that seems to articulate big visions, big convictions. Right? So articulates big values, seems to be about something grander than narrow bits of interest. It's articulated through rhetorical speeches, media, and so on, that create big narratives about identity, about values, about hope, etc., etc. That sort of was kind of the appeal of Obama in his campaign the first time he ran for president, right? Posters like this kind of express the idea that people had about him. Now, might have disappointed those hopes, but the example here is simply meant to illustrate sort of the alternative vision of this. What exactly is this charismatic quality? And Weber is famous for doing this big picture sort of distinction between the sources of authority. Authority is not the same as power. You can have power because you control resources or force and so on. Authority is the ability to have other people do things you want them to do because they think it's the right thing to do, right? And he thought, well, there are kind of three sources. There's the legal, the authority that comes from having a legal position, right? You obey because it's the prime minister who's telling you to do it, or because it's the president who's telling you to do it. The authority of tradition and custom, you obey because it's the customary thing to do, the sort of norms of the place is what we normally do. You obey also because there's something special about the individual, charismatic quality. You think that the individual has some gift that makes them worth following them, makes them worth doing things they ask of you. Now, not every demagogue is a charismatic person. These are sort of somewhat separate ideas. You can be a demagogue without being charismatic. just won't be that effective in some way. But the thing about charismatic leaders is that I've ever saw this as kind of intention. So the charismatic, somebody who has charismatic authority is the kind of person who can articulate new values, new visions of what's possible, to change the narrative in some way. And because so this is a distinct source of authority, charismatic leader can overcome those constraints of tradition, law, institutions, and so on. There's a kind of, Weber sees modern society as having a kind of inertia. We do things in particular ways. Legal, bureaucratic constraints encroach on society all the time. Tradition, customary ways of doing things, existing values are kind of weigh on everyday ways of doing things. A charismatic leader breaks with that, can articulate new ways of doing things, change the narrative, break the norms, say and do things that are in some sense taboo, or they're not the things that everybody says. Right? Now, Weber takes this idea from early Christian theology. The term charisma is a term that first appears in the letter to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul. So it means the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Right? And until he starts speaking about charisma, it's a pretty obscure term. Like, people didn't use it that much. It's a kind of technical term in Christian theology. And what he does is, he takes this term and he connects it to the idea of authority. He says, how come some people have this kind of special way of have a special kind of authority that goes beyond what's given by legal position or tradition and custom. So he takes this idea of this religious idea of like the gift of the Holy Spirit, and he says, what charisma does, what charisma is like when enough people think that you have something special, then that gives that person authority. It's a relational attribute. Now, we tend to use this term charisma very loosely, so we talk about charismatic leaders all the time, and we, if you're asked to explain what a charismatic leader is, you might say, well, it's somebody who has a kind of personal magnetism, or somebody who can give a good, rabble-rousing speech, or something like that, right? Well, for Weber, what matters is not like the specific thing that the person does, but the fact that other people think they have a gift. They have, and other people have to validate that charisma. Charisma is not an inherent quality of the leader. It's something that other people see in the leader, and they validate it. And so there are kind of two ways of doing this, of thinking about this. You can think of something like sociologists sometimes call success charisma. Where is the source of charisma? Well, it's when you have a leader who, somebody who does something that other people in the group consider kind of miraculous, very unlikely. They achieve something that other people thought couldn't be done. Maybe there's a big crisis in the country. This person comes to gets elected to office, and they achieve something quite unlikely. Turn the country around. By the way, this is sort of the classic explanation of Hitler's charisma in Ian Kershaw's book on the Hitler myth. It's not so much about speech making, it's about having come to power at just the right time so that the German situation suddenly improved once the Nazis came to power. And this seems very unlikely. You had a big crisis, all of a sudden, Germany starts doing well, gaining all these victories and so on. So the person is seen as having achieved a kind of miraculous success. Right? But they have to keep proving this. If they don't succeed over time, their charisma is lost. And again, this is sort of sometimes used to explain Hitlerian charisma. Once, the Nazi armies, lose at Stalingrad, the charisma of Hitler sort of goes down. Right? But you can think of this model sort of more broadly. See, success and doing something that actually furthers the interest of a group, and it's something very difficult and therefore unlikely. And so Weber speaks of like miracle making, and his examples are about, his historical examples are always about people who achieve things that seem miraculous to others. But there's a different kind of charisma as well, which has less to do with achieving something that furthers the interests of a group, more about articulating a vision, a narrative around the structure of value that's important to a group. The charismatic leader paints a picture that is extremely convincing to a particular set of people. It makes them understand themselves better than they themselves used to be able to. Also, the charismatic leader kind of gives them a vision of who they are. So, you can think of it as, so what is representation? A charismatic leader represents a particular group. And representation is about two things. I have this picture there. It's Las Meninas by Velázquez. It's a classic picture where he spoke about the representation. The artist is representing the Spanish royal family, but also about the representer who is in the picture as well. Right? So when a politician represents, they do those two things. They provide kind of a picture of the group that they're representing. You are the people who is pure, the people who is, Kiwi or British or American. You're real Americans who have these characteristics. It paints a picture of who they are. And it paints a picture of the politician. And I am your champion with these characteristics and so on. So representation, you can play with the meaning of like the ideas. So we think of political representation as we might think of pictorial representation. We represent in both senses. Politician paints a picture of the people that they are representing and of themselves as their representative. And that's more obviously clear in the case of the charismatic leader who has that kind of representational charisma. They're good at drawing pictures for a particular group. They create a picture of a group through their actions and speech that is sort of like, in the case of Trump here, what Trump is good at is being a larger-than-life version of the people he represents. It's not that he is like them. It's not that he is, he has an identity in the sense of being same social background or class and so on. But he's sort of like a larger-than-life version of them, of the people he claims to represent. Now, in representing them, another thing that's interesting about the way in which Trump represents people is that, sorry, I just want to get this quite right. So, the charismatic politician like I was saying, charisma is norm-breaking. When you think about how Trump speaks, for instance, he's constantly breaking what polite opinion considers to be the norms. He's constantly saying things that get people, drive people crazy because, he's saying all this stuff that you're not supposed to be able to say, right? Because it's, bigoted and prejudiced and, horrific and, all kinds of other things, right? But precisely because of that norm breaking, he sort of provides this picture of people, who he is. He's not beholden to tradition, custom, the existing set of institutions, right? And articulates at the same time a different vision, not a particularly inclusive vision, but he paints a picture of who are, say, real Americans, rather than the unreal ones who don't count, perhaps. So, now, I spoke earlier about kind of two kinds of charisma, the kind of success charisma and the representational or symbolic charisma. And they go together. You can't survive on representation alone. A charismatic leader has to constantly prove themselves. They have to constantly show that they can further the interests of the group. They have to constantly show that they're actually providing those miracles, in a sense. Right? It's a little bit about why Trump constantly says that he's winning. You have to win all the time if you're a charismatic leader. If you don't win enough, lose, your followers desert you. So you have to pick a lot of fights. Right? And charismatic leadership is precisely about constantly winning those fights. And remember, when Max Weber thinks about the very ambition of democratic politics is about struggle. It's about ultimately about different visions of values. So at the highest possible level, you're talking about leaders who can further their own vision of those values, their own vision of those interests, and why they're important, and so on. Now, you can do it the Trump way, appealing to prejudice, exclusionary tendencies, and so on, or you can do it in a different way. But the basic point remains similar. Right? Another leader who was often thought to be charismatic, the late Hugo Chavez. I have him here because I'm originally from Venezuela, so he's somebody I'm fairly familiar with. And, leaders like Chavez were very good at bringing into being a new group. There are lots of people who felt marginalized in Venezuelan politics before he came to power, poor, excluded mostly. And he gave a narrative to those people. And in giving them a narrative, he kind of created the group. He brought it into being as a self-conscious group, who suddenly saw itself as, yes, we are the people who were excluded before. We are the people who have this genealogy, who are connected in these ways to, the figures and independence and this particular anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles and so on. Right? So charisma is about creating those groups, and it's also about struggling for them. I mean, Chavez was a deeply polarizing figure. He was also constantly fighting and prevailing over his opponents. Again, this is connected with the success bit. He was very fortunate, in fact, that during most of his time in power, he had a favorable economic environment. So he could do a lot of things, could do a lot of those miracles that his followers demanded. but he also was able to create that particular narrative of success. So, finally, I mean, you have somebody like Obama, who again, creates a persuasive narrative of embodying certain kinds of hopes. He's the first African-American president, and so on. But if you fail on the success side, if it's all representation and no substantive success, then that dims afterwards. There's a lot of disappointment in Obama in politics, right? Even though he's still well liked. But the kinds of narrative that people like this created resonated because they seemed to be about something larger than themselves. Very different from the sort of professional politician who seems to be only about narrow, transactional sorts of interests. So, let's kind of summarize here. So, a demagogue creates a kind of credible representation of the group as the people. That's what makes populism kind of a standard way of standard kind of discourse that the demagogue is going to use. The language of populism is going to be inevitable in democracy. And they're going to divide. The demagogue is always saying, it's the people against the elites. The good people against the bad people. Right? Whether or not we agree with this is a different matter. So some people will agree with this particular vision, and some people won't. But this is clearly going to be more credible whenever other institutions have failed. We normally hear about sort of the crisis of representation in democracies. Think of why does Trump win? There's a kind of failure of the establishment. That's one of the reasons. Right? What we think of it's convincing enough to enough people that there is a failure of representation. People turn to the demagogue who paints a convincing picture of themselves as the people versus those who fail, the elite, the establishment, and so on. Now, so if we're ever looking at early 20th century, thought that modern societies have lots of constraints that come from their fact that they're kind of highly complex societies, hemmed in by all kinds of technical, bureaucratic processes. There's a lot of stuff that seems out of people's control in modern societies. There are all these kind of impersonal forces that hem in public action and so on. And he sees the charismatic leader, charismatic figure, as one way the main way, perhaps, of breaking through those constraints. Charismatic leader is the one figure that has enough authority to break through those impersonal processes. But it is a double-edged sword. Right? I try to put examples of charismatic figures that for most of us might seem bad, and charismatic figures that for most of us might seem good in some way. Right? But it is a double-edged sword, because charismatic leadership is destructive of institutions. It is norm-breaking. It is institution-breaking. It might articulate new visions of order, new visions of identity and values, right? But it also can be irresponsible. Escape the constraints of legality, precedent, tradition, and so on, and do strange stuff on Twitter. One way Weber puts this is that there are kind of two vices in politics for him. The political leader who loses a sense of what's possible objectively, the constraints of political action, and the political leader who doesn't take responsibility for their actions, who engages in things without consideration of the consequences. And charismatic leaders are very prone to these vices. Like you're in a bubble of adulation from your followers who would tell you that you're great because that's what they see. They truly, genuinely see, figure of great significance, whether it's a stable genius or a vessel of hope, right? There's something special about them. So the demagogue is always in danger of taking themselves to be beyond the constraints of everyday politics, taking the responsibility for his actions too lightly and being concerned only with the impression he's making. So what do you do? So the key thing here is about what Weber calls the ethics of responsibility. And he makes a distinction here in what we might call, so he talks about two different kinds of ethics. One is the ethics of conviction. The ethics of conviction is what you might think of as somebody who holds fast to a particular set of values, right? No matter what. And charismatic leaders are often like this. They have a vision, and they want to hold on to that. But having a vision doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to take responsible action. The ethics of responsibility is when a politician looks at the consequences of their actions and they own them. Right? And there's a kind of existential dimension to this, because ultimately, for Weber, state power is uses coercion, uses violence, and in its extreme case, it's the power of war and peace. The dead bodies on the line at the end of the day. So the responsible politician has to understand that, has to try to understand what the consequences of their actions are, and to own them, to understand that these are the compromises I'm making. Right? Now, the charismatic politician often doesn't, because they think that they fly above the laws of political gravity. So what you need to do, what a democracy is supposed to do, is to keep holding them responsible. You hold people responsible, so there has to be ways in which ordinary citizens, even if they're in thrall of the charisma of the leader, can validate that. They can go to the polls, vote them out. It's kind of the duty of the citizen. There's also the duty of other politicians. To the extent possible, other politicians have to challenge one another. When democracy is working well, the charismatic leader can't just simply paint a nice picture. Other politicians have to be able to challenge it, and in that way, they can point out the flaws of the picture. They can bring alternative pictures of the people to bear on the charismatic leader's picture. And so there should be ways in which political leaders are selected in ways that promote that ethics of responsibility, promote that a disposition to understand that politics is not a game, that politics ultimately has real consequences down the line, and that we, sometimes we have to own those consequences. People say, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That's the phrase that Weber quotes, comes from Luther. That there are convictions on the line, but once I've understood what the consequences of my actions are, I still stand by those convictions. So, to finish up, so the charismatic demagogue is this kind of double-edged figure, because in some ways it's the main way in which new values, new visions of the common interest can break through sort of existing, ordinary, traditional ways of thinking. So it's a revolutionary force. And he's going to articulate this and struggle with other leaders. But they can only be a positive force in democratic politics if the people, other politicians, can hold them responsible. So it's a constant struggle between new visions and holding them responsible in ways. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Javier. That was really wonderful. So many questions. I'd almost rather just go straight there. So while I'm pulling up my PowerPoint, I will tell you that that I'm just going to say a few things about populism, and then we'll get into it. Yeah, good. Oh, whoops. It's weird. There really is a ghost in here. That was so interesting about demagogues, and I really want to spend most of our time talking about that, but I'll just say a few things about the phenomenon of populism to frame our thoughts, and then we can talk amongst ourselves, which is going to be fun. So the first thing I wanted to say is that, and I'm echoing a lot of what Javier said, people really disagree about populism. And as Vicky said right at the beginning, what we're trying to do here is to shake up the received notions and not necessarily begin with a preconceived notion about what's good and what's bad about populism and demagoguery for democracy, for progress, for the people. There's lots of disagreement, even about what the phenomenon is. I'm going to contrast. Here we have Nadia Urbanati with a really sort of negative reading of populism. She's talking about the way that populists always define themselves against an other. And she talks about the way that populists may use the language of constitutionalism, but they always undermine it. And the examples of this, I got to say, these days they really are legion. You just think about what the Peace Party in Poland is doing with regard to judicial authority, and that's just one of countless examples, not to mention my regrettable countrymen. But then we have Ben McKean, who has a very different view of populism, who's interested in the resources that you can get from populism. Ben's populism is much broader than this sort of Peronist right-wing movement. He's interested in contrasting people against exploitation, but not necessarily according to some sort of ascriptive difference. And for McKean, it's possible to have weirdly, populist solidarity across borders. It just depends on who is the sort of oppressor that is being identified. Is the oppressor a disadvantaged local minority, or is the oppressor a quite advantaged global capitalist? For McKean, that makes all the difference. So what I want to say in just a few minutes now is for democracy, we shouldn't be too proud to learn from populists, even the ones we dislike. We should be willing to learn from them because they're popular for a reason. They are demonstrating things that are unsatisfactory about the status quo or about recent history. They show us, as Javier said so beautifully, they paint us this picture about what's wrong. And they are objecting, even when populists express disgust, which is often morally extremely wrong, straight out wrong. A populist disgust is, Donald Trump talking about foreigners. There's no defending that, right? But some populist disgust has to do not with ascriptive characteristics. Some populist disgust has to do with misbehavior, with unseemliness, with corruption, with practices that unjustly disadvantage them and undo us all as a potential unified people. And that kind of disgust is something we should learn from. The basic elements of populism, whatever valence you put on it, are the same. And they're unobjectionable on the face of it. Right? We should have respect for the lived experience of most people. Right? And that is one of the things that Donald Trump, for whatever one thinks of him, it's hard not to think of him. Life would be better if we could not think of him. But his followers insist that their material experience in their last 30 years or so of material experience is something that ought to be paid attention to and not just ignored by elites. And the criticism of elite free riding is another thing that we should learn from populists. So the populist criticism is often taboo breaking, norm breaking, as you said, very scary. It's especially scary when it's directed at vulnerable minorities. But it is vivid for a reason. Right? The language of those who would unjustly exploit us is the vivid language that has been like that over the centuries, because it's hard to break that norm of respect toward our betters. It could be 18th century talking about tyrants as if they're polecats, or it can be turn of the century robber barons who were supported by those party machines. It's the language of vermin. Right? All of this is dangerous and scary. Sometimes it's even close to hate speech. Sometimes it is hate speech. But it's something that we should pay attention to because it identifies a real problem, often elite exploitation. Generally speaking, it's democratically unjust when you replace the interests of the many with the interests of the few. And that is what a lot of, however inarticulately, a lot of populist discourse is trying to bring out. Think of what happened in France over the last 6 months or so when the supreme technocrat, Emmanuel Macron, attempted to impose his vision of environmental policy on the country, and to do this at the expense of ordinary and especially rural people, right after having been associated with a tax break for his capitalist buddies. Right? There was mayhem. There were riots, and he was forced to withdraw his tax. Right? We might not think that the yellow vest people are our favorite people that we want to have coffee with, but we need to learn from their message. Their message is top-down policy, however rational, from within the bubble. What did you call it? That was beautiful language. The bubble of adulation. That's really good. Top-down policy from within the bubble of adulation is a mistake, and the populists will show you in no uncertain terms that it won't work. So I think I'm going to skip my section on how did we get to this juncture And just point out that Thomas Piketty wrote a very good book that may look like a doorstep, but it's actually incredibly entertaining. And he's got a new one out that should be in English soon. So we'll take Piketty as read. And we'll notice that traditional parties have been declining, and some of us would attribute at least part of the traditional party decline to elite capture and lack of responsiveness. There's a particularly interesting version of populist takeover in the European elections this year. In Germany, it was associated with the Rezo Effect. It was really fun to consume German media after the recent European elections. The mainstream center parties had been just blanked. It was amazing. They were still able to field anybody. And the non-mainstream parties on the left and right picked up a whole bunch of seats. And all that the sort of ordinary elite could talk about was how unfair it was that the election was stolen from them by YouTube influencers. But what was interesting is that people chose to listen to the YouTube influencers. So people like Rezo and people who make their living teaching other people how to do their makeup and their hair made a video together and said, we don't care how you vote, but if you're unsatisfied with the status quo, don't vote for the people's parties. And you know what? The Greens and the far right both picked up votes. We should listen to their lessons. I'm going to skip the how we got here. Hint, it was oligarchy. And I'll just echo a few things that Javier said. No kidding. Real democracy is agonistic. And there's something really dangerous about the desire to put an end to that contest. Right? If you have a technocrat who's telling you that this is a win-win, you should look and make sure that your pocket's not being picked. And we've had anti-agonistic politics for too long. It's not surprising that there has been a reaction. So what sorts of positives can we take from this? I think populist lessons ought to be learned across the spectrum. And the example I want to give us to discuss, if we're interested, if we need one more thing to talk about, there's already so much, is that environmental populism is actually quite a powerful rhetoric. And as I was listening to Javier just now, I was thinking, is Greta Thunberg a responsible, charismatic demagogue? You know, I think I could make that argument if I had more than 3 minutes lead time. She certainly is a norm breaker, and she paints a picture and she shows people who they are. So it's an interesting thing to think about. The nice thing about environmental populism is that it identifies another. It is unsatisfied with the status quo, but it is also transnational. So here is a democratic argument that is also a populist argument that has to do with environmental things. The interests of the overwhelming majority of people on Earth are being subverted by the interests of a few extractors. Right? Most people on the planet are they're subsistence farmers and fishers, and many of the rest of us would prefer to go on breathing going forward. Right? So we have the perfect recipe for populist complaining. And in fact, there's a reasonably small but reasonably good literature arguing for environmental populism. In particular, they say, we need to pay attention to the material experience of ordinary people, in this case with regard to things like groundwater pollution or air pollution or being subject to having to drink tap water that's been poisoned. Right? These sorts of very ordinary, very material concerns are the basis for a potentially quite subversive environmental populism. There are all sorts of interesting things that we could do to pursue the right kind of populism. Most of them have to do with institutions. Javier's right again. Populism, demagoguery, it is destructive of institutions. Maybe sometimes that's not a bad thing. It's a dangerous thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe we should have institutions for selecting leaders that are a little less predictable and technocratic. My favorite surveillance mechanism, right? How are we going to hold our charismatic politicians to account. I like the institution of ostracism myself. We should identify threats to the people and, take their stuff and kick them out. I think that we could really make out like bandits and also do democracy a lot of good. So it doesn't have to be as violent as ostracism or conventional populism. I think getting beyond elite capture need not be extreme and violent. In fact, there was a recent article in that most conventional of outlets, Science, that talked about how we can use grassroots deliberative institutions like citizen assemblies, not coincidentally being recommended by Extinction Rebellion these days, in order to get around the logjam that has enabled technocratic elites to dominate the rest of us. Thank you.
Hello? Yes? Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa and Javier, for raising so many interesting ideas. So it's now time to turn it over to all of you and to be populist. And so you can actually ask either one of them any questions.
Can I start? I have a question.
That's cheating, but yes.
I'm going to start real quick. You can think of your questions. What I want to know is, are there any stories about charismatic politicians doing anything other than die before they leave office? They always seem to just leave in a box. I don't want Greta Thunberg to leave in a box.
I think what I was saying about populists having to prove themselves, charismatic leaders having to prove themselves, charisma is not an internal attribute that you always have. So if you can lose it and then go on to have a normal life or a disappointed post-charismatic career.
What is the difference between the technocratic elites, as we sometimes call it, and the technocratic evidence or fair advocation? So we see repeatedly that technocratic policies have been the ones that are better. For instance, in Pharmac, that's been the most powerful. We have a populist reaction which undermines that. Now, we could have articulated that better and had more dialogue about extending it, but the populism totally undermines that which is an advantage right across in terms of water quality, health, education. In New Zealand, we see repeatedly the technocratic or the expert policies have been the ones we should be looking at, all the advice from the Commission recently on social welfare and so on. And we don't have a dialogue which takes that forward, principally because of the demagogues who can easily take account of simple, primitive, emotional responses to undermine that image, and the media assists in stopping proper debate. So surely, as the Centre for Science Communication says, we must start taking the scalpel to these entirely erroneous emotional responses and use the same techniques of persuasion as they are using, such as was used against the tobacco industry in California very successfully. So rather than resile from good, sound policy, we need to make sure the public begins to appreciate it and sees the flaws of rejecting it.
Do you want to first?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, from the point of view of the sort of thing I was speaking about, yeah, it's about fighting, right? So you have to fight back. If if your view is that, hey, but it's not simply articulation. Like politics is never going to be seminar debate with clear rules and so on. Not that seminar debates are that way either, but politics is always going to be, in some ways, a dirty sort of game. And the charismatic politician can articulate that side of the debate, right, as well as the other side. You're going to have to fight with the same sorts of weapons and the same weapons. You can't expect the sort of the technocratic evidence to simply prevail in those debates. Now, it's not to say that the technocratic arguments and the technical, the science behind these things is bad, in a way, but it won't prevail by itself in the political game.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Javier. Two excellent presentations. My question is this. Well, firstly, a comment. I think it's possible to be a charismatic politician without being populist. Mm-hmm. But my question is this. Do you think that in a sense, because populists often exploit legitimate grievances within a society, that is, issues which have been neglected by establishment politicians, do you think in a sense they actually are catalysts for transformation? Now let me explain that. Because many populists, they exploit legitimate grievances, but they cannot actually deliver on the promises they make. But they do sensitize people to those underlying problems. So I'm just be interested in your take on this, that when populists do fail, do they actually, in their wake, do we actually tackle some of the problems that have been around a long time? They've played a role, in a sense, maybe a negative role in some senses, but in heightening our awareness of those problems. In both the United States and the UK, where we've seen populist movements and populist leaders, they've exploited long-standing problems within the society, the relationship with the haves and the have-nots, and they've identified people who are responsible, often foreigners. But that's not, of course, true. But I'd just be interested in your take on this, whether we may see more concerted effort with their failure of trying to resolve these problems, deep problems. Thank you.
I'll say one thing then. So just really quickly, I think an example of that without an individual charismatic politician would be the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? Which there wasn't exogenous change before it. We had the same structure of relationships, but somehow after the Occupy movement, it became commonplace for people to think about the consequences of extreme inequality, and policies were Occupy failed as a movement, but not as an agenda setter.
I think one thing I would say that is definitely possible for this to happen, but I mean, charismatic politicians are a double-edged sword, and they can leave a trail of destruction in their wake. So even if people pay more attention to, say, issues of inequality in, say, the U.S., there's a lot of damage that can be done. And it's kind of in the nature of a thing, like, if charismatic authority is destructive of norms and institutions, and can destroy them in ways that are not particularly productive for later politicians. So it might be that after Trump we get, more xenophobic, more nativist politicians, trying to copy the success of Trump as well, even if they have exploited certain legitimate grievances among a part of an American electorate.
Is that inappropriate?
Maduro. Well, I wouldn't say Maduro is a particularly charismatic leader.
He followed on and is suffering in the same way you're talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, the Chavez, government sort of set a particular path and sort of stuck in a particular gear. And then Maduro, who is an organization man, so really, he's the other kind of leader, and he's very good at maintaining a particular coalition together. He's very good at staying in power, even under very dire circumstances for the majority of the Venezuelan population. So again, there's a kind of there's destruction, and then there's, things are set in a different course, but it's not everything is easy to shift.
I have a question up here, but could the two of you share that particular microphone so we can get Lisa taped as well?
I thought it was loud enough.
more than a question. It's what I learned from you, from the two of you. I'm here as a member of the public, and I've got a science background, not in politics or economics. So what I've picked up is that when the elites in a society prove inadequate to the needs of society, the phenomena that you discussed would emerge. Now, with the elites, like, historically there's a culture of responsibility, but given the very rapid progress in science and general prosperity, etc., I believe there's also a need for, it's as if the elite needed to learn how to deliver a responsible solutions to society. So the gentleman there spoke about Pharmac, for example. Therapeutic products have that. So and there's a sea change. They're expensive as well, needlessly expensive. But our politicians and the officials have not, it's as if there's a need for a culture of responsibility, and there's an educational need for the elites as well. And when it's a failure of elites that you spoke to, well, that's my take on it. Thank you.
Culture of responsibility?
Sure. Yeah. It's certainly the case. Like I was speaking about crisis of representation. When people feel that existing elites no longer delivering benefits and so on, or they don't address some important grievances, and yes, they have a tendency to turn to people who paint the right sort of picture, right? They indicate in a credible way that they can do better. But, that picture might be misleading, like all pictures are, right? It's not just because somebody comes along and says, I alone can fix it, doesn't mean they can, right? Doesn't mean they can't deliver in those. So it's, what I was trying to get at the end is, it's kind of the role of society to try to hold these people responsible when they arise as well.
Hi, I just wonder from both of you actually, your knowledge on populism and demagogues, what is your perception of the recent comments made by Simon Bridges, leader of the opposition? He said that everyday New Zealanders don't care about the Christchurch call. Do you perceive this as a red flag?
I don't feel qualified to answer that. Do you feel qualified to answer that?
No.
Anybody else? It's a good question. Somebody must have a good answer. Go for it.
It is a very good observation, because I think it's Mr. Bridges' attempt to inject a bit of populism into the New Zealand foreign policy scene. He went to Beijing and gave a gushy interview there, and he came back and pronounced the Christchurch call is not really connected with ordinary people in New Zealand. Their focus is, as he put it, on solving problems like, a failing health system, etc., etc. I think that he will pay a big price for that, though, because he said last week that the Christchurch call wouldn't achieve anything, and we already know this week, I don't know if anybody heard it, but there was a fascinating interview this morning with Susie Ferguson. I think it's Susie Ferguson, the RNZ interviewer, and she really gave him so if you want to hear a populist or an attempted populist in action who gets ambushed and caught, please listen to it tonight, because it's a wonderful example of someone who's trying to ape populist tactics who've got found out. So I think in New Zealand it's going to be difficult to pull this off. The nearest we've had to a populist is Mr. Winston Peters, but he calibrates his populism. He's a populist when he's in opposition, and he talks about immigration and problems like that, but he lowers that profile as soon as he's got he does that to win popular support or he's 7% of the vote that he needs. And then when he's in government, he forgets all that rhetoric. He becomes very responsible. He's a pragmatic populist.
Hi, I'm another member of the public too, so I'll just sort of add my voice to that. I wanted to follow up on Robert's earlier question, and sort of be a little bit provocative in the sense of if you accept your argument that someone like Trump is a creature of, the Rust Belt's 30 years of neglect and sort of been trampled into the dust. What's it, and also if you accept the sort of consensus that the effect of Trump is going to be long-lasting after he leaves office in terms of, the damage it's done to constitutional and sort of other institutions in the US, and probably also, in the international order as well, like the UN and the WTO and those sorts of places. What's it going to take for the opposition, for want of a better word, to get their own, rally behind their own sort of charismatic candidate who, actually respects the rule of law and respects constitutionalism and respects the place of the courts and doesn't sack cabinet members just because they have a sort of a contrary view to him on things like Syria or, be a devil's advocate there and just what's the antidote to Trumpism effectively?
I don't know. But I want to say that sometimes the antidote is not so much about any particular individual. I mean, there's a sort of a two-way street here, right? So the charismatic leader can articulate new ways of thinking, new norms, new values, can break the existing norms and traditions and rules and so on. But other people, in more collective sense, can hold them to account, can, bring back certain norms and forms of accountability that are destroyed by the charismatic politician. So it's not necessarily that it's going to be that the opposition, the Democrats, rally around a new charismatic leader. That may or may not happen. But I don't want to give the impression that charismatic politicians are all there is to politics. I mean, what charismatic politicians are good at doing are precisely kind of disrupting the existing order, providing an alternative vision. But in Weber's view, and it's something I didn't, talk about, but it's a very, consistent pattern that, charisma is not really sustainable. It always gets, the person either loses it or it gets routinized, it gets incorporated into new institutions, new ways of doing things. That's sort of the life cycle of charisma. You have the disruptor, but then have institution building that's not necessarily about any individual person.
Let's just say a couple things. Thanks for that good question. I think it would be a mistake for us to hope that the institutions that are being destroyed and disrupted can come back in the same form. I think it would make more sense to look at new resources of surveilling the charismatic leader, of exercising sort of citizen responsibility by holding people accountable, by doing things like regularly saying things that are true in fora like the one depicted on this slide. Going back to a defunct 1970s vision of representative democracy, about which we probably remember more good things than were true, would be a mistake. We have to sort of move through. And it is interesting to think about the different resources that New Zealand offers versus we've mostly talked about the Europe and the US. And there are some reasons to think that the path that has happened there is going to be quite different here. It does seem to me, I'm not an expert on this local stuff, or I'm not an expert on Simon Bridges, but trying to enact that sort of politics here seems sort of almost anti-populist because it paints a picture of the different people.
Anyone else? Well, it looks like I get lucky last then. Javier, you ended it up by talking about Weber's ethics of responsibility as a solution to the problems caused by populism. But I'm interested in finding out what you actually think about that solution. I'm kind of thinking in terms that it seems to be working to some extent in Britain, in Westminster, with certain Tory MPs standing up to Boris Johnson. But I'm not an expert on American politics, but from the outside it does look as if Republicans are not really standing up to Trump in the way that many people would hope would happen. So I was just wondering about your reflections.
Well, as with any sort of ethical idea, the problem is that people don't do what they're supposed to do many times. And so, I mean, Weber has this marvelous image at the end of his lecture on the profession and vocation of politics about what is politics about? You know, politics is about a long, slow drilling of hard boards. It's never one thing. You know, you're never done, right? And it's kind of like, you know, when we think about, you know, politics is kind of dispiriting most of the time. You know, it never seems to end well. The Republicans don't stand up to Trump, or, you know, politicians don't act on, you know, various pressing problems from climate change to any number of other things, right? And so the message here is basically about, well, it's not one, you know, it's not that you get, you know, a politician with the right ethics of responsibility, which would be nice to have. It's like you have to keep pressing. You have to keep acting in that direction, pushing in that direction.
Oh, no, that's beautiful.
Well, I think that's a great way to end. So can you join me in thanking Lisa and Javier for a very interesting lecture? And thank you to all of you.